Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversational Witchcraft with me, Dawn the Kitchen Witch. Before I forget, please make sure that you like and share, subscribe, hit all the buttons, hit the bells. I don't know what the things are you're supposed to hit, but hit them so you know when we have new episodes and fun things going on. Likey and subscribey and all that jazz. Today on the show, I'm very excited because I know I'm always very excited, but I only book awesome people for this show. And our guest today is one of the most awesome. Today, we're chatting with Jason Mankey. Jason Mankey is a third-degree Gardnerian High Priest, a prolific witchcraft author, 9 books and counting. A bit of a nomad in his younger years, Jason has lived both in the Midwest and in the American South and currently resides in California's Silicon Valley, where he helps to run 2 local covens with his wife, Ari. A giant history nerd, Jason is especially intrigued by the history of the horned god, witch and magical history, and occult influences in rock and roll. Jason regularly lectures and leads rituals at Pagan and Witchcraft events in both North America and the UK. Oh my goodness, what a resume.
Yeah, I mean, you always make it sound better than it probably is. I mean, the UK stuff, I've done some book signings and some workshops. It's not like I've gotten a headline of big conference or anything. But
It's
it
still
sounds
pretty.
cool though to throw the UK in there.
I haven't been to the UK to do any book signings. That's pretty fucking cool.
Well, if you get to write your trip off. My wife's always like, "Why do we have to do this?" And I'm like, "Well, it's good for taxes."
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Anytime you can sign a book when you're out, you get to
Yes.
count that day off on your taxes.
Yeah, everything, the food, the travel,
Yeah.
everything, you get to write it off because you're an author.
Right. Like we were in Glastonbury one day and they had one copy of one of my books and the lady there was like, "Can you sign it?" And ours like, "Ka-ching, we get to write today off." I was like, "Good.
It's still pretty cool though,
Yeah.
going to the
Thanks for
UK.
having me. This is really fun."
I'm really excited. So like you're one of these people that I feel like we should know each other, but we don't know each other. So we have a lot of mutual acquaintances, but we hadn't met until just this past March.
March, end of March.
We were at the same event here in New England, the Magical Marketplace. And lo and behold, we were on a panel together.
Right.
And I think we kind of blew it up.
I thought we were the best on the panel. I mean, the other people aren't here, so I can say that. But I thought we were the best.
I'm gonna have to agree with you. I mean, like again, like I think everybody brought something different to the panel, and it was a panel on using the elements in witchcraft, which I was
Yeah.
like, I don't know why they put me on this panel. I'm a kitchen witch, but all right, I'll tell you my opinions.
Yeah, I didn't know why I was on it either. It's really like not my thing, right? And I didn't even know how you would make that topic carry over for an hour. That
And
that
it,
we got through an hour really impressed me.
I know, and we were hilarious. Let's just be honest. We should always be on panels together, and better the more weird the topic is, probably the funnier we'd be.
I've been blessed to do a lot of panels, so I've kind of learned the secrets to doing panels. The first is don't talk too much, right? Because there's always one person on the panel who every question is a 20-minute answer. And people just get bored of that person. So if you can do like punchy, fast answers, the crowd loves you for that, and they never get sick of you.
Sound bites.
Yeah.
I mean, I I don't I haven't been on a ton of panels. Like that was maybe like my third panel in my lifetime. So that's a good tip because I tend to be very wordy, obviously.
I didn't think that you were like overly wordy on our panel, though. I
Oh,
thought you kept things pretty punchy.
thanks. I appreciate that. I'm one of those people that's very, as you are, and this was immediately recognizable, like super comfortable talking in front of a crowd, super comfortable on a stage. Am I wrong?
I got there. I still sometimes get really nervous before I do it to the point where I want to go throw up. But once it starts, it's easy.
Really?
But like getting there is hard. It's gotten easier as I've gotten older and I've done it a lot more. But for a long time, it was like nerve wracking.
Can you remember the first class or the first panel that you had to teach on witchcraft? And like, what was that experience like?
It was something I shouldn't have done because I wasn't ready to teach it. I was just a little snot nosed kid. I was probably 23, 24, and was like doing the Wicca 101 thing at a local metaphysical conference, but nobody else was going to do it. Right.
Right.
So I was glad that I did it, but I really shouldn't have done it because I really wasn't smart enough to do it back then.
I mean,
And
you
then,
obviously had some knowledge or you wouldn't have been asked to do it.
yeah, I think I volunteered though. So maybe I really didn't have the knowledge, but the owners of the shop said, yeah, that'd be great. And I had a friend there with me too, who was a little bit older than me. So it wasn't just me pontificating, which was probably a good thing. And most of the people who went were younger and didn't know anything about the topic really. So I
Hmm.
probably didn't come across as too stupid. A few years after that, though, I did my first Horn God workshop at the same kind of event, and my dad went to that. And my dad sat in the crowd and watched it and everything. Then he's like, "I'm going to take you out to dinner," and then he told me everything that I did wrong,
No.
and it was the most useful thing that I had ever heard after doing a workshop. And I got a lot better because of his critiques.
Was he just like critiquing your like presence and your delivery, or did he actually like weigh in on the topic?
Not weighing in on the topic, he was weighing in on the presentation of the topic.
Wow.
Right, like don't that's a big thing now for me.
So
It's like,
hard.
don't and a lot of people do, and it just means that you're thinking and the brain is giving you this little holding thing, and it's really not awful, but my father was like, "Don't do that." So, I've been really conscious of it now for 25 years thanks to my father.
Yeah, that's a real legit public speaking technique. And they say that you're supposed to just now, like I wanted to say, you're supposed to like hold back, pause, and rather pause with silence than pause with an and.
Right.
We all struggle with that. I mean, that's even just regular conversation, right? That's amazing. So you gave your very first workshop, kitchen in witchery 101 or witchcraft 101 in your 20s. So
Right.
were you writing at that time or were you just teaching? Where were you at in your career and how did you get there?
Career is a strong word. But my friend Dwayne and I, who did the workshop with me, we had a local zine. This was the 90s. So we had a zine called The Wiccan Read, READ. And I wrote in the Wiccan Read about various things. I sometimes go back and look through it all these years later, and it's
Yeah.
really terrible. Especially me, it's just an angsty,
It was the 90s.
yes, very angsty, very much Gen X. Everything is falling apart kind of writing a lot
Little
of the
did we
time.
know.
Yeah. There are some decent things in it, but it wasn't particularly good. But it's nice to have. I mean, most people don't have a written record of their witchcraft experience that
Yeah,
was shared in a public space
right.
for decades on end.
So was that something you were doing, like how did you find this path? I mean, again, it sounds like you started writing when you were really young, comparatively. Most of us don't start writing in our late teens or early 20s or teaching in our late teens and early 20s. How did you find the path of witchcraft? Was this something that you were always interested in, or was it, as I like to say, did the path find you, or did you find the path?
I was always interested in religion when I was a kid, and I was always interested in the unexplained and the occult. So if you remember your local library or your school library, the UFO books and the Bigfoot books were always right next to the occult books.
Yeah,
Right? And so I read all of those books many times cover to cover. And that was probably the start of it. It's like I knew a little bit about witchcraft before I approached it as an adult because I had read those other books.
mm,
I think I checked out one of Sybil Leek's books from the library in the summer between seventh and eighth grade and did my first spell from that book. And it worked just to find a lost item. And it scared the shit out of me. And
yeah,
didn't want to do any more spells for years. When I was 21, though, I found a DJ Conway book, Celtic Magic, which is a terrible book in so many ways. It says that the Celts practiced Wicca, and Wicca is thousands of years old and that sort of thing, which was very common in the early 90s,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
But DJ Conway was a very good writer, historically bad, writing good. And she wrote basically about Wicca in that book, and
Right.
it just resonated with me in a way that conventional religion didn't. I was 21, and I remember my first prayer to the goddess after reading that book. It was the summer of 1994, Fourth of
Wow.
July weekend, and I'd
Wow.
read Celtic Magic. And when I was a kid, I always said, "Lord, keep us safe this night, secure from all our fears. May angels guard us while we sleep till morning light appears." A prayer my grandmother made me memorize. But one night I was like, "Lord and Lady, keep me safe this night." And I felt something when I said that. It was a big deal. It was like a jolt of electricity went through me, and I remember it very specifically. So that was really when I got into
Wow.
witchcraft, was age 21, and then started doing the public things a few years later, just because there was no one else doing them where I
Right.
lived. And I think that was a lot of it. I mean, the 90s were a weird time. Witchcraft was pretty hot in the mid 90s. You had the
Mhm.
craft and that sort of thing. You had witchcraft periodicals at bookstores like Borders, remember Borders, and Barnes
My
and
God,
Noble.
I loved Borders. It was like
Yeah.
where you went with your friends, or like when I started dating my husband, even like in 2000, believe it or not, we would still go to Borders.
Yeah.
And that would be like date night. You get some books and you sit on the floor and drink a cup of coffee and hang out in the store. It was like the best place on earth. Absolutely.
So, I mean, there were still a lot of people who were in initiatory traditions who really weren't very public with being in traditions.
Yeah.
Right? So you just didn't have a lot of people who were open about practicing, and I wanted to find community. So if I wanted to find it, I had to be loud and help try to build that community. And I got lucky. There was a student group at Michigan State University that was started by now very good friend of mine. Didn't know that person, of course, when they started, and that was another way in. And we had a lot of people from the community come to the pagan student group. It wasn't just people in their teens and 20s. There were
Wow.
30, 40, 50-year-old people, even 60 and 70-year-old people sometimes, because we were really the only open thing in the community. I met my wife at the pagan student group.
No
Yeah,
way.
it was really, really beneficial. And I ran it for a couple of years, which is one of the reasons I ended up talking and doing things, because my job was to sort of be the face of the pagan student group. And I was a little bit older than everybody else. So a lot of the kids I ran around with were 19, 20, and I was 24, which is really a teeny, teeny difference when you think about it now. But at the time, it was a big deal,
I
right?
think it
Like,
is a big deal for sure.
yeah, you're 23, you get to write the ritual, right? You have 2 more years possibly of experience than the rest of us.
Right. But you also get to buy the wine and the beer and the,
Yes,
because you're
yes, I
over
also had to do that.
21,
Yeah,
you know.
no
But
risk
I
going
think
to jail for everyone, yeah.
but I do think that those couple of years, especially if you've been studying, they make a huge difference in your growth as a spiritual practitioner, but also in your growth as an adult. Like I look at who I was when I was 20 versus who I was when I was 25, and I'm like, wow, that's that a lot of growth and maturity happens in that time. So I'm not entirely surprised. I want to go back to something you said earlier about, you would say this prayer, and this one time you said Lord and Lady, and it was like a lightning bolt moment for you. I know for myself personally, growing up in a very conservative Italian Catholic family, that, those moments of realization or verbalizing were very big and transformative moments. Was this for you, like, was that moment something that you could point to and say, like you said, you felt something, but did it also, for me, it did. So I'm asking if you did as well. It felt a little bit like a rebellion, like a rebellion in saying, oh, I can create, or I can believe, or I can worship in whatever way I choose. And this is the start of that. Can you talk to that a little bit?
I didn't really think of it as rebellion. I thought of it as that experience that I wanted when I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior and didn't feel anything, right? I guess I'd always been looking for that mystical experience with religion. I always wondered, if you're sitting in church, why doesn't Jesus just show up, right? I mean, can't he do shit, right? I mean, why does nothing happen? Why am I just singing
Right.
dirge like hymns? Where's the
Right.
energy? Where's the passion? Where's that feeling of being close to something greater than myself? And I didn't really
Mm.
feel it until that particular prayer. I do think when you identify with the label witch, though, you're identifying with sort of a subculture, and you're identifying with something that's transgressive, right? I mean, you're saying I am a part of society, but I'm not a part of your society. It sets you apart. People
Mhm.
always complain, like not always, not everybody, but there are people like witchcraft isn't political. And I'm like, the very act of calling yourself a witch is a political act. It
Yeah.
differentiates you from everybody else. And witches have always existed on the margins of society. We should stand with those who are also on the margins of society, who, are abused and taken advantage of or called lesser, right? That's, I think, our job as witches.
I could not agree with you more. I feel like um witches, and again, we're using the word witch as a blanket term. Yeah, we also use the word pagan as a blanket term for people that, maybe practice all sorts of different kinds of earth-based spiritualities and polytheistic and all that kind of stuff. So let's just be clear on that. But I think that witches, those of us that define as witches and pagans, we have been othered,
Hmm.
right? We have been othered. And so we should stand arm in arm with people of every other othered community, right? Whether that's people of color, whether that's LGBTQ plus, whatever that is, we have all been othered, and used in some way as scapegoats, and definitely persecuted. Even though, like, I'm a 40 something white lady who lives in the suburbs, as a witch, I can't be incredibly open about that in certain spaces due to all kinds of stuff, right? So I agree with you 100% that just the act of calling yourself a witch is political and is taking a stand 100%.
And I think people forget just how recent it was, like really brave to call yourself a witch. I mean, in the 80s with the Satanic Panic, and that didn't end in the 80s. It lasted through the 90s to a degree. I think there are still people in jail as a result of the Satanic Panic, blamed for crimes that never really happened because
Right.
people were sort of making these things up in their brains. And right now, with some of the QAnon stuff, we're looking at a new Satanic Panic, right? We hear about people eating children or whatever else and all this weird shit. I mean, that's Satanic
Yeah.
Panic Part 2. It's a lot of the same stories.
Right.
And there are people, when you identify as a witch, they're going to identify you with all of that nonsense
Yep.
and make
Yep.
for a really awkward Thanksgiving dinner with Uncle Joe.
Right. Right. Or
Yeah.
like, at the PTA meeting,
Yeah.
or, like all that sort of thing. Okay. So I run a business that's based off of my spirituality, and the name of the company is Cucina, Aurora Kitchen Witchery. And people will walk up to me at a farmer's market and be like, oh, you're not a real witch. Are you going to put a spell on me? And I'm like, I am a real witch, and that's not how it works. And they're like, whoa, what? You know? And there's still, even now, even today, there's so much stigma around the word witch, which is crazy. How do you handle that?
I live in California, so it's not so bad here, right? I mean, I live in Silicon Valley, so there aren't a ton of witches now in Silicon Valley. It's very tech oriented and stuff,
Mhm.
but it's also a pretty non-judgmental place, and it's a
Yeah.
real melting pot of America. There are
Mhm.
people from all over the world who live here, who practice various religions and faiths, and we're all very accepting of one another. So I don't really have to worry about it. When I travel, I'm usually going to pagan festivals. So as long as I get through the airport, it's gonna be
You're good to
okay.
go.
Yeah,
Good to
we're
go.
good to go.
So,
But yeah, but
no,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
I know that there are places where it happens, right? I talk to enough people, and I know there are places where it's not always safe to say you're a witch. We have been in a witch bubble again for a while, like we were in the mid 90s, and
Mhm.
witchcraft is more popular, I think, than it's ever been. You can go to stores now and find witchcraft related things at boutiques, not
Right.
just earrings with goddess symbols on them, but also books and things. It's
Yeah.
a very different circumstance than it
Yeah.
was, just 10 or 15, 20 years ago.
Right. Like, you can go into, like, you go into like Kohl's, and they've got like little plaques with the moon phases on it and stuff like that. And you're looking around, and you're going, yeah, that's witchcraft, right? Like
Yeah.
that's, like, did people not realize? But you've been a practicing witch for a very long time, and you've been writing for a very long time. You've got a bajillion books out. I have a couple of them because I'm a giant fan. But this one is probably my favorite. It's The Witch's Wheel of the Year.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
That's my favorite. And I was lucky enough because you signed it for me at the Magical Marketplace. But yeah, I love the way you write, Jason, because it is really accessible, but yet it's so in depth, and that you can turn to these books as like staples in your practice and reference guides. Did you set out to be this kind of author, or did you just set out to create books that you wanted to be able to access?
Couple of answers there. Like, it's not just one answer. First, I wanted books that I wish I'd had when I was starting out.
Yeah.
If you go back and you look at ritual books in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, the rituals are usually pretty bad.
They
You know,
are.
they are, and it makes me feel bad to say that about people like Scott Cunningham or Ray Buckland or whoever else, or Silver Ravenwolf. I still love to ride a silver broomstick, but the rituals aren't particularly good. But we also didn't have a history of doing ritual that was particularly long,
Right.
right? I mean, this is still a very young movement in a lot of ways. And for a long time, there were people who thought, you really weren't supposed to share rituals because they were all oath bound things in your tradition or whatever. So it took a long time for us to share good rituals. In the Wheel of the Year, I wanted to share what I thought were good rituals, especially for covens and large groups. I think large group ritual is maybe the hardest thing to do. So I was
Mhm.
looking for books that would have answered my questions when I was younger. I remember I was at a festival. This was before I wrote books, but I was doing, I think, a lecture on the horn god, which is like one of my favorite little pet topics. And I had a lot of friends who were academics. I just ended up meeting a lot of academics, and we were about the same age. And one of them came to a workshop I did, and when we were done, he goes, "That was great because you take academics' work and you make
Yeah.
it accessible and understandable." And I thought that was a really nice thing to say. I've always been really big on trying to get my facts right, even when sometimes I wish they were wrong, and then sharing that with an audience, but doing so in a way that's not boring and, as I said, is accessible, right? That's written in plain English, where you don't have to, you know, consult a dictionary to understand what the academic is saying.
That's
So,
so important. It's
yeah.
especially if we want to get more people engaged or informed in all types of energy work and all types of witchcraft, because we don't know where the reader is. We don't know where that reader is at. Is this person an 18-year-old person who's reading it for the first time, or is this someone who has been, in practice for, 2 decades or 3 decades? Either one of these people needs to be able to get something out of the work. And I have to agree, because your work is academic in terms of factual and historical and all of that, but yet it doesn't read like stereo instructions, which I often found with a lot of the books from like the 90s. It's just like, I get it. This is the rules, and this is this, and that is that, and that. And I'm like, that's something I hated about Catholicism, was like, these are the rules and you have to follow the, you know, it should be joyful and easy and fun, and your work does that, which I think is wonderful.
I often think that we are very hard on Christians when it comes to matters of history, right? Like, if they say something that we know isn't true, we'll call them out. Like, that's not really what that is. And I feel like if we're going to do that, we have to be just as good, right? There's no place for fanciful, made up history. If we're going to hold everybody to a high standard, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. So I'm always really big on trying to get the facts right. That's really important to me.
Agreed. And there is so many misconceptions. There's so much misinformation about witchcraft and the history of witchcraft, that's out there. And I think, unlike when we were growing up and we had to go into a store, go into a library and actually talk to somebody and actually get a physical book, with the wonderful and awful internet,
Mm.
it's also equally as terrible as it is wonderful. Um, there's a lot of misinformation out there, you know. Um, what do you think is a common misconception about witchcraft that you'd like to debunk?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think we've gotten a lot better about things. I remember when I started, and this is probably true for you too, is, the whole history of witchcraft was fanciful to say the least, that this is a thousand, like Wicca and witchcraft were very much used as synonyms for a long time. And that this practice is thousands of years old and, it goes back to the dawn of time or whatever. You got that in a lot of Raymond Buckland books. You got that with Starhawk, surprisingly, who
Hmm.
probably should have known better. And there are still people who sometimes repeat that kind of thing. And I find it really frustrating. And people sort of make up fake lineages and stuff. There's an idea, I think, that age confers legitimacy on things.
Mm.
And I don't think age confers legitimacy. What confers legitimacy is, are you getting something out of the experience? And now we're sort of retroactively applying the word witch to lots of situations where the people who were doing these things wouldn't have called themselves witches, which bothers me. Your great 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 grandmother did magic. No
Hmm.
question about that. People did magic, but people from all kinds of faiths did magic.
Yep.
Because they did magic doesn't mean they would identify as a witch. And there's a part of me that finds it really disrespectful to call somebody who, went to Baptist church or whatever their whole life a witch, right? When they would have been horrified by that. So that's kind of one of my current little pet peeves. You know, Lots of people use magic. We're not the only people who use magic. And embrace the folk magic, though. Like, put it into your witchcraft practice.
Right.
It's complementary to that, absolutely. And it's a part of your heritage and your culture and your family. And I think it's great to grab, but it does bother me when people call great Aunt Gertrude a witch, when she was a Baptist.
Right. Well, listen, I think that's a really interesting and incredibly important message there. And I never really framed it in my own mind that way. I would say often, I come from a long line of kitchen witches who had no idea that they were kitchen witches. But really, I want to define that now. I want to redefine that and say this was Italian folk magic. It wasn't, it was witchcraft as we understand it, but they were not witches. They were Catholics practicing Italian folk magic.
It's really hard, and I feel like an asshole sometimes when I get on this soapbox, because it is cool, like when if you can think of your family as witches or whatever else. And I think the definition of witchcraft has changed, especially a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, where anytime magic is used, it's just witchcraft, right? It's become a
Mhm.
synonym for magic, which is fine. The word witch has always been very adaptable, malleable, and people have used it for lots of different things over the
Mhm.
last several thousand years, but especially over the last couple of centuries.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like your point about, yeah, practice your folk magic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people you're related to were witches. They might have practiced magic, but not necessarily witches. They weren't necessarily witches. But do you think that there's some thoughts out there, and I particularly believe this, that anything you do with intention, anything you do with a devotion and intention can be considered a ritual, and a ritual then being a magical act.
Yeah.
So what is that definition with the blanket of witchcraft? Like, how do those things go together, or do they not go together? So if I'm doing things with ritual intention, but I'm not defining as a witch, but that is witchcraft. So how will we reconcile that?
I don't know. I mean, is praying the rosary for a specific outcome witchcraft?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I mean, I get it that it kind of is, right? Because we're doing this magical act. When we think of witches, we think of doing magical acts. But then at the same time, the old lady praying the rosary would be horrified to be called a witch.
True.
Right? It's a really perplexing sort of question and situation, I think, like trying to define all of these words and exactly what it is. To me, a witch is somebody who practices witchcraft, but most importantly, a witch is somebody who self-identifies as a witch. Right? What's it take to be a witch? It takes saying, I am a witch. And to me, that's about all it takes. People are always trying to say that witches do this and this and this. And I've met so many thousands of witches, and most of them, like the Sabbats or whatever, the equinoxes, solstices, cross quarter days. But then you'll meet somebody who's like, nah, those don't really resonate with me. I don't like them. So you
Mhm.
can't. There are so few universals really when it comes to people identifying as witches, other than perhaps magic.
I think that's brilliant, and so true because part of being a witch is creating in my mind because I'm saying, if you're a Wiccan, you are practicing Wicca. If you are a Buddhist, you are practicing Buddhism. But if you're saying I am a witch, I am a pagan, part of the beauty of identifying in that way is creating your own spiritual practices, pulling from ancestral magic, pulling from folk magic, doing what feels right for your own practice. And so what a witch looks like for me and what a witch looks like for you, completely different things, and all are good and acceptable.
I mean, if I had one rule about witchcraft and about, people's practices, is that there are no absolutes, right?
Mm.
When people talk in absolutes, that bothers me the most. This is how magic works. This is how the gods are. I'm like, really? Like, you are 100% sure about that your interpretation is the only interpretation that matters, right? That your experiences are so much better than everybody else, right? So as witches, we just do what works best for us, and we try to do so in a considerate and understanding manner. Doesn't mean that you go out and, steal things from other cultures and stuff without, understanding it and pretending that you're doing something that you're really not doing. But, for the most part, we just use what works. And the whole history of magic, though, the whole history of magical use has always been sort of the bubbling cauldron with lots of ingredients from lots and lots of different places, right? I mean, if
Yeah,
something works magically, people adapt it, right? No matter where it came from. And a lot of times we kind of lose the origin points of some of the magical ideas. We use folk magic, we use things from the grimoire tradition. It all kind of mixes together, right? And we pick what we like out of that big bubbling cauldron.
I love that analogy, and I love that sentiment. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break, hear from our amazing sponsors, and we will be right back on Conversational Witchcraft with the really incredible Jason Mankey. We'll be right back. We're back with Jason Mankey on Conversational Witchcraft. I'm just like digging this whole conversation with you today about, everything from, how we define witchcraft to your journey. It's just really great. And I'm wondering, you, because of your wealth of knowledge and because of your incredible resume of writing and teaching, people must ask you for a lot of guidance. People must ask you for advice often. I'm wondering, what do you think people should be asking you that they're not?
I think people should be asking me like how to do big rituals. Like that's my pet peeve. So I do a lot of festivals, and I have trouble going to public ritual because in my head I'm just critiquing the entire thing, which again makes me sound like an asshole, and I'm really not. I'm actually very nice, but I'm always like, how do you do this better? How do you do this? And a lot of times people are doing things where the ritual is 20 minutes longer than it needs to be because you asked everybody to do this one specific thing, and that works great for 18 people, but it doesn't work well for 80 or 90 people, right? And those are the kind of things that frustrate me a lot. I often tell this story. So I was at a festival once, and there was an author there who was doing this ritual like at 11 o'clock at night. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I'll go to that. And there's a big line. And he's like, I want people I know up front at the ritual and stuff. Jason, I know who you are and stuff. Come on up here. And so I did. And he challenged everybody at the door with a sword. And if you were really into the ritual, he would prick you with a lancet. Sterile. I mean, it wasn't like you were like anything terrible was going to happen. But there were 90 people at this ritual, and each interaction took a minute, right? So think about how long it
Mm.
took just before you got into the ritual. And I was one of the first people in. And as soon as I got there, I had to pee like a racehorse. And I couldn't leave because there was only one door. And I would have walked past everybody who was already waiting to
Right.
get in, who was at the ritual. all I did was the pee pee dance for like 2 hours that night. It was bad. You know, so those are the kind of things that I think about, and I wish people would ask more questions about. And and it is difficult because we don't really have the resources that a lot of other spiritual groups have, right? I mean, there are, some Wiccan or pagan kind of like clergy things or church groups or whatever else, but most people don't really get exposure to them or have the time to take those classes. So we're often winging it, right? And
Mhm.
we're learning through trial and error, but a lot of us have done this for a while. So ask questions and, figure out how to do like a large group ritual that gets everybody involved that doesn't take 2 hours.
So what's like your top advice, your top thing for large ritual, like that you would say do or don't do? Like one thing, what is it?
Wow. You want people to have a moment where they get to do something, but you don't want to like do the thing where everybody goes around in a circle and they have to have some sort of awkward interaction that they may or may not want, right? Give people things to do, but don't put them on the spot, and don't give anyone a microphone where they get to address the whole crowd.
I have to say that I think that's brilliant, and I've been to so many public rituals and, at festivals, but also, here we have the Temple of Witchcraft, and 9 times out of 10, Temple of Witchcraft large rituals are wonderful and fantastic. But in my lifetime and 2 decades of, being a public witch and going to festivals and things like that, the worst is when you're in a room of 100 people that aren't your community, and whoever's leading the ritual wants you to go around and like share what you saw in meditation, or do something where you have to express. And like, I'm very expressive, so I'll fucking talk to anybody about anything, but you can see on the faces of other participants that they are not comfortable. And if I brought somebody in who maybe this is their first time or something, now they're on the spot and they feel uncomfortable. Or especially in an age of COVID where if you have to hold hands, that's uncomfortable. So I think you're really tapping into something that is very important in the community, because people are just like, oh, I want to throw this ritual and it's going to be this way. I'm going to just stick everybody with a sword. Yet no, that's you have to think about the people on the receiving end of that, right?
I went to a ritual recently, and it was the opening ritual of a conference, and there were a good number of people there, maybe 70 people, and we were supposed to go around the circle and look everyone in the eye and welcome them to the ritual, touching like your heart and then touching their heart. And there are a lot of people who don't like to be touched, especially women in that sensitive area.
Yes.
And you were very close to people. And I was just thinking, wow, this is a great way for everyone here to get COVID.
Yes.
Right? And it also just took a long time. And that would have been a great way to start a ritual with an intimate group or a coven or a small circle of 20 where everybody was on the same page. I didn't think it was a good way to start a ritual with 70 people, just because it went on and on and on. And again, there are some people who don't like to look others in the eye. They don't want to be put on the spot like that. I don't like that, really. Teaching
Yeah.
a class is one thing, but then, having to go around, just I don't know. I get awkward and embarrassed sometimes,
No,
so
I
it
think
was
that's a
strange.
really good point, especially because we live in a community in the witch space where we are so welcoming to people that maybe don't feel comfortable in other spaces. We're very trans friendly, and we're very friendly to people that might be dealing with autism spectrum things, and social anxiety things and stuff like that. And so to ask everyone to be comfortable on a certain level that maybe the facilitator is comfortable on, I feel like is not necessarily fair for the expectation of acceptance and comfort that we are kind of promising by just being witches. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I don't want to like throw people who do rituals under the bus either.
Of
People do
course.
it with the best of intentions,
Yes.
right? But it's just there's a lot to take into account. How everybody's going to react to something, how long is it going to take? And oftentimes you have to readjust your rituals on the fly depending on how many
Mm.
people are there, or sort of what's going on, or what the energy in the room is. And the only way to learn how to do those things is through practice. So my early rituals were terrible, right? So, I got lots of practice.
How are they different now?
Well, especially large group rituals kind of got rid of those parts that slow everything down.
Mhm.
When I think of my favorite rituals that I've presented in public, especially for the Sabbats, large groups, 60 to 100 people or whatever, you have a large space and you give people freedom to move around that space and do a lot of different things. I think one of my favorites was an Imbolc ritual where we drew down Bridget in 3 forms, and you
Mm.
could go and talk to the goddess while you were there, but you
Mhm.
could also find the returning light and then go and put that light on a particular altar and shine your light. They were all for causes. And then when you talked to Bridget, she gave you a coin from Ireland, because I'm like, I'll spend the extra money to import like no longer used Irish coins.
Yeah.
And then we had like a fake well that you could make a wish and throw it down the fountain or down the well with
Right.
the coin from Bridget. So you had all these different things to do during the ritual, but nobody could hijack the ritual and nobody had to do anything, right? You didn't have to do anything that made you feel uncomfortable. So if
Mhm.
you didn't want to talk to Bridget, you could just grab the light and do that. Maybe you could
Mhm.
see the well but not throw anything down it. You had lots and lots of choices. And we also made sure that everything moved fast. I was at a ritual once with something similar. I think it was Hecate, that, 3 aspects of Hecate were
Mhm.
drawn down. But there was one priestess who was just more popular than everybody else. So everybody got in her line, right? So then there's the other 2 priestesses who are basically just sitting up there drinking a glass of wine. They really weren't
Right.
drinking, of course, but they didn't have anything to do. Well, everyone just waited, and I was one of the first people to go through the ritual. So then I had to sit for an hour while I was just waiting for everyone else to go through. And I was like, how do you fix that log jam at the ritual?
Mhm.
Well, you don't give anybody a choice of who they talk
Mhm.
to, right?
Mhm.
You let the gods take care of it. Let
Yep.
gods take care of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's some of my favorite rituals I've ever been to is the Hecate's ritual at the temple. I mean, if I'm gonna bring somebody like a non-pagan who's like, I want to see what's going on, I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna bring you to Hecate's ritual because it's amazing. And what we do is you get some sort of a token when you walk through the door. So there's a basket, with a red token, a black token, and a white token, and you kind of have to just blindly grab one of these tokens, and that will be the priestess that you go to.
Yeah.
So, it moves, and again, the whichever aspect is meant to speak to you will speak to you. You shouldn't choose that. It should choose you. It's just it's fabulous. I'm sorry, we got on this whole ritual thing. I have so many other things to talk to you about, but this is fascinating for me. Um, we talked about the common myths. I wanted to circle back to something you had said before about the horn god being your quote favorite pet project. And I'm looking at this book and I'm going, this doesn't look like a pet project, Jason. Okay.
Well, it was
This
a
is
long
like
time. It was a
this,
long time coming.
okay. This is not a
Yeah.
pet project. Okay. And I don't think he would like you calling him your pet project. Okay. Um, what
Well,
is it about the horn god that really calls to you?
I mean, when I first found out about the horn god, I was terrified. I didn't want
Mm,
anything to do with the horn god. I thought that, I would have a god and he would be like Apollo, with beautiful blonde hair. He'd be a sun god, he'd be conventionally attractive, right? He wouldn't have horns on his head and he wouldn't have goat legs. To me, when I was just starting out, I'd come from Christian background, like many
mm,
of us, president of
yeah.
my church youth group and stuff when I was in high school. And I
Mm,
was like, that's
mhm.
just too close to the devil, right? So I didn't want to do any of that. And then he just sort of made his presence known in my life. Like, you have no choice, right? You will do these things and you will be loud about me. And I don't know. There's something about gods like Pan and Dionysus, especially. Cernunnos is sort of a separate case, but Pan and Dionysus were deities that lived on Earth, right?
Mhm.
Pan did not live on Olympus. Pan lived in Arcadia and in grottos and just hung out with nymphs all the time and got drunk and had fun and fornicated and masturbated and watched his sheep. That was what Pan did, right? But he was here on this planet. And Dionysus becomes an Olympian, but started here, right? Walking around, sharing grapes, sharing drunkenness, but not too much drunkenness. Dionysus really looked poorly upon people who were sloppy drunks. Be tipsy, don't be a mess, right?
Don't
Those,
overindulge.
yes, yeah. But they were here, which is really different from a lot of other deities,
Mhm.
right? So I was really drawn to that. And then, of course, Pan in the 19th century, he becomes the muse of English poets in a
Mm.
lot of ways. And he becomes the connection to the natural landscape and the natural world, right? He's the metaphor for speaking about wild places. And those are the places that I, grew up loving. I was a Boy Scout, and one of the best things about being a Boy Scout was just getting away from my evil stepmother, but also going out into the woods, for, a couple of days and stuff and being able to have that experience. And Pan is sort of a literary conduit to that. So when I really began exploring the Horn God and became comfortable with the imagery of it, I found all of these different things that I loved. And Kronos, too, to me, represents that sort of wild nature. We don't know a lot about Kronos. We don't really know his myths or whatever else. But there is something about him that just feels like it's in the landscape, for lack
Mm.
of a better term. And that really appeals to me. Like when I'm outside, I feel these gods. And then
So,
when I'm in the bedroom, I feel these gods
I
too.
mean,
Yeah, but I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
for
yeah.
sure. For sure. I think the horn god is very, very sexy. Um, and I feel like that's a, I don't know. I have no frame of reference for like when I started discovering who he was and presence, and it must have been early on when I started like learning about Beltane and the maiden and the horn god, and it must have been about that same time where I started learning about fertility gods and everything. But for those who don't know, can you explain a little bit of the difference between Kronos and the horn god? Because I think that people might use them interchangeably.
I mean, I think if you look at the images of sort of the bigger horned god idea, they tend to look more like Kronos than Pan. Kronos had the antlers of a stag on his head.
Mm-hmm.
He was often sitting with his legs crossed, like kind of looks like he's meditating. We when I say we don't know a lot about Kronos, his name only appears 3 times in the historical record, and all 3 of those times are a little bit different, which doesn't help. But there
Wow.
is like really consistent iconography in what we see with Kronos. And we see the antlers on his head, we see the sitting posture, we see him often carrying a torque and sometimes a serpent. The torque's a symbol of royalty and power and wealth. The horns, of course, suggest that connection to nature. The sitting posture, could be meditative, but it also seems to be a posture that the Celts used often, right? They would sit on the ground. They would sit while they were waiting to hunt, and which makes him a god of the people in a lot of ways, right? Because he's
Mm.
like everybody else. The serpent, often associated with prophecy, sometimes associated with buried treasure. And there's a few instances where Kronos is seen with rats nearby, and rats were symbols of death. So Kronos is
Wow.
probably a god of liminal spaces between life and death. I know that if you read things like Janet and Stuart Farrar, sort of that British traditional witchcraft kind, not, gosh, I'm not British traditional Wicca style. I guess
Mhm.
you often hear him be called the Dread Lord of Shadows, right? Uh, Suggesting that this is a god of death, but also of rebirth. And I think Kronos in the ancient world probably had some of those characteristics as well.
Wow. And then conversely, the horn god being more like Pan.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our general image of the horn god, very much sort of Pan, like, oh, this is the god of Beltane. Let's all go out and jump around and be happy. I think the horn god is more complex than that.
Mm.
You have certainly the part of Kronos, a part of Pan. There's also a lot of folkloric devil in the horn god. And that really makes people upset. Like, no, the horned god isn't the devil. And I'm not saying that he is the devil, but there's a lot of folklore about the devil. And if you read things like Gerald Gardner and Margaret Murray, they use that folklore to suggest certain things about the horned god. I mean, the god of, pleasure to a degree, indulgence, finding your own way, being in control of your own path. Those are all things about the horned god.
Mhm.
And those are all things that in a lot of ways come from the folkloric devil. The folkloric devil, is a figure. It's not this, person who's guarding a world of fire and brimstone.
Mhm.
It's more like a person who says it's okay to have a good time.
Mhm. And is there an element in that folkloric devil that is about knowledge and understanding and knowledge of self?
Certainly. I mean, Lucifer, the idea of Lucifer is about finding yourself. It's about knowledge.
Mhm.
And I think that plays into some of the ideas of the folkloric devil. This is a lot of this is in the Horn God book instead of just me pontificating about
This
it.
one, this Horn
Yeah.
God book, the
I
Horn
don't,
God
I
for
don't,
Witches book, this
I
one,
don't like to, I don't like to do the hard sell on
this
stuff,
one.
right? I mean, I know people have many book choices.
Yeah, but you're a writer and you're a
I
good
know.
writer. So let's
And
talk about how awesome your books are. I'm just saying.
But there's, one of the things about the Horn God too, and if you read my Amazon reviews, sometimes you'll read titles like Pan, the Social Justice Warrior, or This Book Was Too Woke for Me. And which I'm really proud of those reviews. But
Yes.
in the ancient world, though, there were female pans. There's a figure that has been found in the area where Cronos was worshipped in Gaul, France, that is contemporary with Cronos, and it's a female figure with some sort of antlers on top of her head. In
Look at
recent
that.
years, we've seen this interest in a figure called Ellen of the Ways. There's not any sort of historical Ellen of the Ways, but if you read between the lines in a lot of texts like the Mabinogion or whatever else, you sort of see outlines of perhaps a reindeer goddess that today we call Ellen of the Ways. So to me, the horn god isn't even just a dude who likes to have sex with a giant boner out in the woods. The horn god is this very encompassing figure who offers many different pathways to experience their mysteries. And then, I mentioned Pan and Kronos. There's also a couple of female green men in churches, which is really different.
Yes.
And Dionysus was very much a gender bender in his time, and the people who worship Dionysus too in the ancient world. So there's a plethora of things. Pan has always been very important to gay men, especially. And yeah, Pan didn't discriminate when it came to sexual things. So the horn god is this really big, encompassing figure.
Well, you said it before, there's an element of pleasure that the horn god kind of represents, and pleasure is not defined by I like to fuck this person, I like to fuck
Right?
girls or I like to fuck boys. It is pleasure, whether it is food or sensuality or sexuality or smelling flowers or taking naps or drinking wine, whatever it is that's pleasurable for yourself and for others. He kind of gives you, I want to say permission. He kind of gives you, like, we're like the Christian God is like, no, you can't do any of those things.
Right.
The horn God is like, yeah, baby, come on, let's just hang out. There's a freedom there that I think is beautiful.
When you look at stories of the folkloric devil and sort of the witch trials, they always said that the witches did a couple of things. And when you think about them, most of them are pretty great things. So the witches had sex. Oh, how terrible! When
Those
you look at
horrible
really
people.
like repressed society talking about that, I'm sure was an outlet. The witches engaged in gluttony. Oh no, they got to eat food. The witches danced. Oh no, they got to have
No,
fun and do these things. The witches practiced magic. Well, of course, the witches practiced magic. The witches had initiation ceremonies, which means that all of these things then were sacred to them. And
Mhm.
then, sadly, the last thing they said these witches did was sacrifice babies. But let's ignore that part,
I
which obviously
mean,
wasn't true. I mean, there were no babies
I'm
sacrificed.
I'm sure there were no babies sacrificed, but I wonder if something like, witches being, wise women, midwives, the keepers of a lot of female reproductive things, perhaps what the reality was maybe women were able to um, terminate a pregnancy, or maybe they were able to, help someone who maybe had a stillbirth or something like that, that being the reality. And then it translated into sacrificing babies because we need to demonize, these people who are dancing and singing and fucking and eating.
Well, the sacrificing babies is kind of a long-term like allegation sent at minority religious groups. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
pagans accused Christians of doing the same. Jews were accused of it during the Middle Ages and early modern period. And we see it now again with some of the weird QAnon stuff. I mean, it's just this ongoing thing. Like, what is the worst thing that you can possibly think of? I guess it's sacrificing infants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that always becomes the thing that these bad groups do. And if it actually happened, there would always be some sort of physical evidence, and there's never been any physical evidence for any
You
group.
you just kind of blew my mind a little bit, and we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to get into it, but you just blew my mind a little bit and going, "Oh my God, have we been having this same conversation with, oh, we're going to, the pro-choice, pro-life, blah blah blah, and the villainizing of, oh, you're going to kill babies. Like nobody is killing babies. Can we just take a breath?" You know what I mean? Like I never really created that parallel before. So now you've given me something to really like sit and think about. So thanks for that, Jason.
You're welcome, I think. I guess.
Jason Mankey, this has been a wonderful, very informative, really fun conversation. And I'm so glad we got to sit down for an hour and just talk about everything. So tell our listeners where they can find you online, how to buy your amazing books, and what you're working on now.
So I write for Llewellyn, so the books are available everywhere. If your local witch shop does not carry them, which is probably going to be the case, ask them to order it for you, and I'm sure that they will. But there's also Amazon and all that other shit out there. I'm pretty easy to find. There's only 4 Jason Mankeys in the world, as far as I know. One of them is a Christian preacher. I always kind of feel sorry for him, but not sorry for him at the same time. I'm the one who comes up first, so you just get me. TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Yeah, I think that's the big four, right?
Okay.
Those are the ones that I'm on the most. Yeah, and right now I'm writing a biography of Raymond Buckland.
That's so
So,
cool. When is that due to
oh
release?
God, you're not going to see that for at least a year. My guess is, let's say, hopefully Christmas of 2024.
So
You
next year.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's hard. It's a hard
That's
thing to do, but
that's
it
that's a big undertaking.
but it's kind of fun, and you learn things about the history of what we do. And Ray was a really pivotal figure. I mean, some of our beliefs and things that we think were passed down for before Buckland come from Buckland. So
Right.
that's
That's
I find
amazing.
that really fascinating.
That's amazing. So, Jason, we're going to have all of your links and your information on our show notes, so people will be able to find you and stalk you on Instagram and other social media platforms, and buy your books and show up at your workshops. Because you're a lot of fun and you have so much knowledge. So, I can't thank you enough for being here. Before I let you go, though, I have to ask you my signature question,
Oh
which
God.
is: Are you ready? You ready? If you could have me as a kitchen witch, cook you one magical meal, what would it be and why?
It would be something Italian, right? And I would just give you the list of my dietary preferences and tell you to knock yourself out, which would mean no onions. I despise onions.
Even if they're cooked down in something?
Yes, they're just gross. You can use onion powder, but you can't use onions. I just hate them.
Really?
I have the palate of a small child, but I will everything else. I would just let you do whatever it is that you wanted to do.
Well, I've never met anyone who didn't like spaghetti and meatballs.
Yeah, but if I can see the onion, then we're done. Like, it just ruins everything.
I would make sure that there were no visible onions.
Yes,
Is
yeah.
it a flavor thing, or is it a textural visual
A
thing? Because
lot of textural visual. I don't like the flavor of onions, but I understand like a little onion is sometimes needed.
how do
Like,
you
I
feel
have
about
onion
garlic?
powder in my pantry, but
You
we
never
don't
use it.
allow onions in the house.
I would die. I would legitimately die. And I have like really crazy like food allergies and stomach issues. And like I can eat nothing, but I can eat garlic and onions and tomatoes. And so my life is okay. You know?
I like hot peppers, so that makes my life worth living.
Oh, do you eat
Have
shrimp?
I do not eat crustaceans.
Do you eat chicken?
I love chicken.
So maybe I would make you a chicken fra diavolo. So it'd be like spicy tomato sauce with grilled chicken over linguine or that.
Yes, that
Yes.
sounds delightful. Yes,
Yes.
that would be what I would want.
Okay. So next time you're out on the East Coast by me, you let me know when you're coming and I will cook you a big meal.
I like it. Yeah, we will
Jason,
make it happen.
thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to do it again and hopefully we'll be on another panel soon.
I
And
hope so.
thank you again so much. And until next time, everyone, I wish you so many blessings and much, much gratitude.